A Spanish defense minister's plane was flying over the Baltic when GPS disappeared. A routine mission, suddenly blind. The cause wasn't a technical failure. It was a Russian jamming operation, one of thousands targeting military and civilian aircraft across Europe since 2022. That same week, the White House signed 2 executive orders on quantum technology. One of them gave the Pentagon 27 months to deploy a replacement for GPS that cannot be jammed, spoofed, or destroyed by any adversary on Earth. The press coverage called it a quantum computing announcement. What actually got signed was something the military has been building toward for a decade, and something the public record only partially explains. On June 22, 2026, President Trump signed Executive Order 14411, titled Ushering in the Next Frontier of Quantum Innovation, and Executive Order 11412, titled Securing the Nation Against Advanced Cryptographic Attacks. The ceremony in the Oval Office included Energy Secretary Chris Wright, Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, National Cyber Director Sean Cairncross, and White House Chief Technology Officer Ethan Klein. The official framing was broad and forward-looking, describing quantum as the third pillar of future computing power alongside artificial intelligence and advanced semiconductors, a technology the government now treats as essential to economic growth, scientific discovery, and national security simultaneously. The headlines that followed talked about encryption deadlines and quantum computers. Almost none of them mentioned what the first order actually instructs the Pentagon to do by September 30th, 2028. Like and subscribe, because what the Department of War was directed to build in just 27 months is not what most people picture when they hear the phrase quantum technology. 3 specific types of quantum sensors, deployed to operational forces. Not tested, not evaluated, deployed. That deadline, embedded inside Section 4 of EO 14411, is the piece of the announcement that the defense technology community spent the following week quietly discussing, because it isn't about computing at all. It's about the electromagnetic infrastructure every modern military depends on, and the accelerating reality that the foundation of that infrastructure is being systematically attacked. To understand why this deadline matters, you need to understand what has actually been happening on battlefields over the past several years, because the story starts not with physics, but with GPS. The global positioning system was built at the height of the Cold War, opened to civilian use after a Soviet shoot-down of a Korean passenger jet in 1983, and deployed at scale during the 1991 Gulf War, where it guided tanks across desert terrain, coordinated naval vessels, and precision-guided munitions onto targets with accuracy that had never before been possible. For 30 years, GPS was treated as essentially invulnerable in practice, a permanent American advantage embedded into every layer of modern warfighting doctrine. Satellites orbit above the atmosphere. Signals travel at the speed of light. The idea that an adversary could routinely contest them seemed like the concern of a distant future. That future arrived without announcement. In Ukraine, Russian forces began jamming GPS as a standard tactical tool, not an edge capability. Drones designed to navigate autonomously suddenly found themselves flying blind. Artillery systems calibrated using GPS positioning suddenly drifted off target. The problem spread beyond Ukraine itself. In the Baltic region, thousands of civilian and military flights reported degraded or completely absent GPS signals, traced to jamming operations centered on Russian territory. Near the Middle East, American pilots flying missions adjacent to Iranian and Syrian airspace began reporting persistent GPS degradation as a routine operational condition rather than an occasional anomaly. In the South China Sea, ships have been mocked into false position readings, their navigation systems deceiving them into believing they are miles from their actual location. The operational consequence of all of this, recognized explicitly in Pentagon planning documents, is that an entire generation of American warfighting doctrine built around GPS precision is now vulnerable in any contested environment against any adversary, who is invested in electronic warfare. And both Russia and China have invested heavily. Electronic jamming and spoofing capabilities that once required specialized equipment are now standard features of adversarial military posture in every theater where American forces might operate. Read that again, slowly, because this is not a hypothetical future problem. It is the current operational reality in which every piece of American military hardware that relies on GPS already functions. The scale of the GPS disruption problem is larger than most public reporting reflects. Finland's government estimated that over 11,000 flights over the Baltic Sea region experienced GPS interference during certain operational periods in 2024 alone. A Spanish defense minister's plane losing GPS over the Baltic is a headline. 11,000 affected flights is a systemic operational reality that has permanently changed how NATO planners think about the electromagnetic environment over their own alliance territory. The military's response has not been to simply add more GPS satellites or strengthen GPS signals, though both efforts continue. The response has been to treat GPS as a contested and potentially unavailable resource in any near-peer conflict scenario, and to invest in navigation technologies that operate on entirely different physical principles and cannot be contested by the same means. The Pentagon's existing fallback, inertial navigation systems, helps but doesn't solve it. Inertial navigation uses gyroscopes and accelerometers to track motion from a known starting position, requiring no external signal at all. The problem is drift. An aircraft navigating without GPS accumulates position error at a rate that, over hours, can translate into miles of displacement from where the system believes itself to be. Precision weapons, precision coordination, and autonomous systems operating across large distances all require accuracy that inertial systems alone cannot sustain over time. The solution that has been developing in American defense laboratories for the past decade is quantum sensing, and this is the technology EO 14411 just directed the Pentagon to deploy in operational units within 27 months. Now understand what a quantum sensor actually is, because the word quantum is so frequently attached to computing that its application to sensing requires a moment of genuine explanation. A quantum sensor does not process information the way a quantum computer does. It exploits the extreme sensitivity of quantum systems to physical disturbances, the same fragility that makes building a reliable quantum computer so difficult, and turns that fragility into an instrument of extraordinary precision. The Army's demonstration from June 9, 2026, 2 weeks before the executive orders were signed, illustrates exactly how this works. Researchers at the Army Research Laboratory published a paper in Physical Review, applied describing a quantum sensor capable of measuring the full three-dimensional direction of radio frequency signals with an accuracy of approximately 2 degrees. The device uses a small glass vapor cell containing rubidium atoms, excited by laser beams into highly sensitive Rydberg, states that make them extremely responsive to electric fields. When a radio signal passes through the cell, the interaction with those atoms encodes the signal's direction, strength, and orientation in a way that classical sensors cannot replicate. That device cannot be jammed. It requires no satellite connection. It emits no signal of its own. It is entirely passive, detecting the electromagnetic environment around it by measuring how that environment disturbs the quantum states of trapped atoms in a glass cell. An adversary who jams GPS cannot jam rubidium atoms. The physics that makes those atoms sensitive to radio frequencies doesn't respond to the adversary's jamming signal by becoming less sensitive. It responds with greater sensitivity. But that's not even the most consequential application hiding inside this announcement. Quantum inertial navigation is the technology that addresses the drift problem directly. Rather than using mechanical gyroscopes to track rotation and acceleration, quantum inertial systems use something called atom interferometry. A cloud of ultra-cold atoms, often a Bose-Einstein condensate, cooled to temperatures near absolute zero, is split by laser pulses, allowed to travel along 2 different paths, and then recombined. The quantum interference pattern that results encodes acceleration and rotation at a precision level roughly 10 to the negative 10 G per root hertz, a noise floor so low it has no practical comparison in classical mechanics. In flight tests already conducted, quantum inertial sensors have outperformed classical GPS-based navigation systems by a factor of 111 in GPS-denied environments. That figure comes from tests the Air Force Research Laboratory commissioned through a company called Canyon Consulting, which received a $49.7 million contract in early 2026 to mature quantum navigation alternatives for operational military use. The 5-year maturation window in that contract aligns precisely with the Pentagon's 2031 deadlines on encryption migration, suggesting that defense planners in multiple directorates arrived at roughly the same operational timeline from completely different analytical starting points. One day after the White House signed both executive orders, the Defense Innovation Unit announced a program called Project Farseer, a multi-phase initiative explicitly designed to transition mature quantum sensing and timing technologies directly to the Joint Force, with an initial investment expectation of up to $200 million within the first year. The timing was not a coincidence. Farseer had been in preparation for months, waiting for the executive order framework to establish the policy basis for rapid deployment. The combination of the executive order mandate and the Farseer announcement in the same week represents exactly the kind of coordinated policy program sequencing that rarely reaches public attention, because the policy headline and the operational announcement appear in different sections of different publications and almost nobody reads both. Like and subscribe, because what the Pentagon is trying to solve is not a science experiment. It is an operational emergency hiding behind a policy announcement. Now here is what the executive orders say directly about the military's other, far more dangerous quantum concern, the one about encryption. EO 142 The order focused on cryptography sets a hard deadline of December 31st, 2030, for federal civilian agencies to migrate their high-value systems to post-quantum cryptographic algorithms. Digital signatures follow by December 31st, 2031. Every federal contractor doing business with any civilian agency falls inside those same deadlines. The order creates a PQC migration lead inside every agency's structure, reporting to the Chief Information Officer, responsible for cryptographic inventory management and migration planning from day one. But national security systems, the specific term covering military and intelligence infrastructure, are explicitly exempted from the civilian order entirely. The Pentagon is not bound by EO 14012. It issued its own guidance. On June 24, 2026, one day after the executive orders were signed, the Department of War released its first ever dedicated post-quantum cryptography strategy. 25 pages. A binding 2031 deadline for every deployed military system to complete migration to quantum-resistant encryption. Chief Information Officer Kirsten Davies opened the strategy without hedging or softening. Nearly every deployed military asset will be affected in some way, she wrote. Adversaries will continue to probe for weaknesses. Costs will be incurred. Read that sentence again in its full context. This is a Pentagon strategy document, a category of publication rarely known for blunt admissions of vulnerability. A senior official naming every deployed military asset as potentially affected by a cryptographic transition is not bureaucratic caution. It is an explicit acknowledgement that the U.S. military's entire information infrastructure, from command and control networks to weapons platforms to satellite communications, is potentially at risk from a future quantum machine that doesn't currently exist, but that official planning now assumes will exist within the relevant operational timeframe. Now here's where it gets genuinely disturbing. The strategy names specific operational domains where the threat is categorized not as significant or concerning, but as existential. The authorization and deployment of nuclear weapons, the coordination of maneuvers with mission partners. Those two operational categories appear explicitly in the Pentagon strategy as the highest priority targets for post-quantum encryption migration, because they represent scenarios where the compromise of encrypted communications would not simply degrade operational capability, but could directly determine the outcome of a potential conflict at its highest possible stakes. Consider what that framing means in practice. The United States currently transmits encrypted communications, authorizing nuclear operations, coordinating allied forces, and managing the most sensitive intelligence information in human history using cryptographic standards that a sufficiently powerful quantum computer running Shor's algorithm could theoretically defeat. Those communications happen continuously, around the clock, in peacetime and crisis alike. An adversary conducting a harvest now decrypt later operation, collecting encrypted American military traffic today in anticipation of a future quantum decryption capability, might already hold years of archived nuclear command communications. The March 2026 Global Risk Institute survey conducted by cryptographer Michelle Mosca found that expert estimates for the probability that a cryptographically relevant quantum computer emerges within the next 10 years now range between 28 and 49%. That is the highest estimate in the survey's 7-year history. A 50% probability of the most consequential cryptographic event in human history arriving within a decade is not a background planning assumption. It is an operational requirement for immediate action. And the Pentagon issued its binding strategy 24 hours after the White House signed the civilian orders, suggesting that the military's own internal timeline estimates were driving the urgency at least as much as the executive branch policy process was. The strategy's 5 major lines of effort are centralizing department governance for the migration, scanning for quantum vulnerabilities, and developing a migration framework, developing post-quantum algorithms specifically suited to national security systems, integrating commercial solutions at speed, and deploying quantum-resistant devices. The order in which these appear tells you something important about how the problem is actually being framed internally. Governance comes first, before scanning, before algorithm development, before deployment. That sequencing reflects an uncomfortable institutional reality that defense analysts have been discussing since the strategy was published. The Department of War has more than 10,000 separate information systems. These systems were built over decades by different contractors, using different cryptographic standards, on different procurement timelines, many of them running on legacy software that hasn't been fundamentally updated in years. Before a single cryptographic algorithm can be migrated, someone has to know which systems use which algorithms, what the dependencies are between them, and which ones can be updated through software and which ones require hardware replacement. That inventory has never been fully completed across the entire defense enterprise. Governance, in this context, means building the organizational capacity to even understand the full scope of the problem before attempting to solve it with a binding 2031 deadline sitting 5 years away. Like and subscribe, because building a complete cryptographic inventory of one of the largest and most complex institutional information systems in human history in 5 years, while simultaneously developing and deploying quantum-resistant encryption standards that didn't exist in final form until 2024, is one of the most complex technical program management challenges any organization has ever attempted. NIST finalized its first post-quantum cryptographic standards in August of 2024, giving the military a stable technical target to migrate toward for the first time. Those standards, FIPS 203, 204, and 205, cover the three main cryptographic functions quantum computers threaten: public key encryption, key establishment, and digital signatures. The algorithms underlying them, Crystal's Kyber for key encapsulation, and Crystal's dilithium for digital signatures, among others, are based on mathematical problems called lattice problems, which are believed to be hard for quantum computers to solve, unlike the prime factorization and discrete logarithm problems that current encryption relies on. Believed, not proven. The mathematical hardness of lattice problems against quantum attack has not been formally verified in the same way some other computational assumptions have been, and the cryptographic community treats this as an important caveat, rather than a disqualifying flaw, since no known quantum algorithm threatens these problems. The performance implications of switching to post-quantum algorithms are also rarely discussed in policy announcements. Post-quantum cryptographic algorithms, particularly those based on lattice problems, tend to produce larger key sizes and larger ciphertext than current algorithms. For high-bandwidth military communication systems, that size increase creates engineering trade-offs between security margin and operational speed. For constrained devices, the kind embedded in weapon systems, field sensors, and legacy communications hardware, the computational overhead of new algorithms may require hardware replacements rather than software updates alone. The Pentagon's strategy's explicit reference to deploying quantum-resistant devices as one of its 5 strategic lines reflects exactly this reality. A portion of the migration is not a software patch, but a physical hardware procurement problem multiplied across hundreds of thousands of military systems of varying ages, manufacturers, and operational environments. The executive orders also direct the director of NIST to revise the cryptographic module validation program within 180 days of the order's signing, meaning by approximately December 19, 2026, to accelerate validations of cryptographic modules. That deadline is less than 6 months from now. It signals that the administration is not treating the post-quantum transition as a multi-year, leisurely planning exercise, but as an active operational program, with near-term milestones running in parallel to the longer 2030-2031 endpoint deadlines. Now consider the dimension of this announcement that the public version of the story almost entirely obscures: the counterintelligence component and what it implies about the current threat environment. The intelligence community pre-briefing of the executive orders, which sources described to NextGov Oster FCW before the orders were signed, included a specific directive for the FBI and broader intelligence community to begin actively protecting quantum research facilities from foreign espionage. This counterintelligence mandate wasn't included prominently in either signed executive orders public text, but it reflects a documented and named strategic concern that the orders signing made official. Quantum research is a soft target. Michael McLaughlin, a former U.S. Cyber Command official who served as Chief of Counterintelligence and Human Intelligence in the Cyber National Mission Force, put the framing directly when he described it to reporters before the orders were signed. Quantum is exactly the kind of target foreign intelligence services prioritize, he said. It is a small field, the talent is concentrated in a handful of universities and companies, and the work sits at the intersection of fundamental research and national and economic security. That combination of extremely high value and a small, open community is what the counterintelligence community calls a soft target. The implications of that assessment extend well beyond university labs. The commercial quantum computing sector, which the executive orders explicitly incorporate, through advanced market commitments, private sector partnership models, and deregulation of quantum-specific market hurdles, now sits inside a counterintelligence framework, whether its companies understand that or not. A startup doing quantum hardware research in a university incubator is, from the perspective of a foreign intelligence service, potentially holding information worth more than anything on its public-facing product roadmap. The talent sitting inside that startup, the research unpublished in any journal, the hardware configurations not yet filed in any patent, represent acquisition targets that don't require hacking a government network. They require recruiting a graduate student. Intelligence officials have repeatedly noted that the quantum computing field's openness is simultaneously its greatest scientific strength and its greatest security. Vulnerability. Academic research in this domain is published in journals, read by researchers in every country simultaneously. Conferences where breakthrough results are announced are attended by scientists with a wide range of national affiliations. International collaboration has been fundamental to the field's progress, and some of the most important theoretical advances have come from researchers whose work crosses national boundaries as naturally as any other academic discipline. The counterintelligence mandate in the executive orders represents a deliberate attempt to impose security architecture on a community that has functioned by design and by culture with very little of it. That tension is not easily resolved. Restricting information flows in quantum research would slow the very progress the executive orders are designed to accelerate. But continuing the current open model while treating quantum research as a strategic national asset creates exactly the kind of exposure that has, in other technology domains, resulted in years of classified work being acquired by foreign services through perfectly legal-looking academic channels. The executive orders don't resolve this tension. They formalize that it exists and direct the intelligence community to begin managing it, without specifying the precise mechanism by which an open research community should also be a secured one. The executive orders address international partnerships as well, with EO 11411 directing the Commerce Department, the International Trade Administration, and the U.S. Trade Representative to identify foreign trade barriers limiting American quantum companies' access to strategic markets. This provision reflects a specific concern that has been building in the quantum policy community for years. Allied countries are developing their own quantum capabilities through national programs that sometimes prioritize domestic champions over American technology access. The European Union's Quantum Flagship Program, Japan's National Quantum Strategy, South Korea's own quantum roadmap, all represent parallel efforts to develop domestic quantum industries that may eventually become genuine competitors, rather than simply customers for American-developed hardware. The executive order's explicit direction to harmonize investment restrictions with international allies and partners, ensuring access to trusted supply chains, reflects a recognition that the American quantum advantage is currently dependent on a fragile supply chain that includes materials, components, and manufacturing capabilities spread across countries whose own strategic interests don't perfectly align with Washington's. Dilution refrigerators, the cryogenic systems required to cool superconducting qubits to near absolute zero, rely on helium-3, a rare isotope produced primarily as a byproduct of nuclear weapons programs. Laser diode supplies for quantum sensors face manufacturing bottlenecks acknowledged directly in Air Force procurement documents. The quantum computing industry cannot scale without solving supply chain dependencies that are currently invisible to most of the public discourse about the technology. The Allied nations dimension carries additional complexity rarely discussed in policy documents. The United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, Germany, France, Japan, and South Korea are all running significant national quantum programs with substantial government backing. In many cases, the technical barriers that separate American quantum hardware capabilities from Allied capabilities are smaller than the classification and export control barriers that limit how much of that American capability can be shared with partners. An ally operating with quantum sensors that cannot take advantage of American design advances because of export control classification is, from a joint operations standpoint, a liability rather than a multiplier. Executive Order's International Harmonization Directive suggests that Washington has recognized this problem, even if the solutions it will require, export control reform, technology sharing agreements, and joint procurement frameworks, are each politically complex in their own right and will take years to negotiate properly. There is also the question of what happens if the Allies themselves produce quantum breakthroughs that the United States needs access to. Britain's National Physical Laboratory has been running quantum sensing programs that may produce navigation technologies competitive with anything currently in American defense development. Germany's Fraunhofer Institute has contributed foundational work on quantum communication. The assumption that American dominance in quantum hardware translates automatically into geopolitical control over the technology's military applications is one that more careful analysis increasingly questions. Now here's where the full picture of what happened in the last week of June 2026 comes together in a way no single headline captured. The White House signed 2 executive orders on quantum technology on a Monday. The Pentagon released a 25-page post-quantum encryption strategy on Wednesday. The Defense Innovation Unit announced Project Farseer and a $200 million quantum sensing deployment program on Wednesday. The Army had published its quantum radio frequency sensor paper and physical review applied the week before. The Air Force's $49.7 million quantum navigation contract had been awarded earlier in the year. Congressional letters of intent for federal equity investment in 9 leading quantum companies had been announced in May. These were not separate events, coincidentally clustered in the same month. They were coordinated elements of a strategic posture shift. sequenced deliberately, with policy providing the legal framework for programs that had already been in development and waiting for authorization to enter operational phases. The public version of this story, 2 executive orders about quantum computing and encryption, misses that the orders represent the policy surface of a much larger operational program that has been running below the public horizon for years. Read that again slowly because the gap between what gets announced in an Oval Office ceremony and what actually changes in operational military programs is almost always larger than any press release can accommodate. What the Pentagon isn't saying publicly, at least not in the same sentence as the executive order announcements, is how urgent the internal timeline estimates have become. The Global Risk Institute survey placing Q-day probability at 28 to 49% within 10 years is not a document that drives casual planning exercises. It is the kind of estimate that produces binding multi-year program authorizations and forces budget fights inside the Deputy Secretary's office. The 2031 deadline in the Pentagon's own PQC strategy was not chosen arbitrarily. It was chosen because internal estimates suggest it represents the outer edge of the safe planning window, not a comfortable buffer zone. The quantum sensors to be deployed by September 2028 are not research prototypes. They are systems already demonstrated in operational environments, including a field test in which quantum inertial navigation outperformed GPS by a factor of 111 in a denied environment. The deployment mandate means active duty units will be equipped with and trained on these systems in time windows that overlap with the most likely periods of adversarial pressure in the geopolitical scenarios American planners consider most probable. Like and subscribe, because the specific countries that have driven the GPS jamming campaigns in Ukraine, the Baltic, and the Middle East are the same countries whose quantum computing programs are driving the encryption migration timelines. Those 2 facts are not coincidentally related. The last week of June 2026 was, from a military planning standpoint, the moment the entire federal government simultaneously committed to what defense analysts have called the most significant cryptographic overhaul since the internet was built, while also mandating the deployment of sensing technologies designed to render the most effective current adversary countermeasure, GPS jamming, operationally irrelevant within 2 years. Neither of those achievements was described in those terms in any of the public announcements. The executive orders used the language of scientific discovery, economic growth, and broad national security benefit. The Pentagon strategy used the measured language of bureaucratic governance and migration planning. Project Farseer was announced through a Defense Innovation Unit press release written in the style of a technology investment notice. The gap between the operational stakes and the language used to announce them is not an accident. Governments do not typically explain the full threat assessment underlying a major military posture shift in the same document that authorizes the shift. The announcement tells you what is being done. The intelligence assessments that drove the timeline tell you why. Most of what was signed in the Oval Office on June 22, 2026 tells you what. The Pentagon's own language, on the rare occasions when it breaks through. The programmatic framing tells you something closer to the why. Kirsten Davies, writing in the opening of her department's post-quantum cryptography strategy, said that nearly every deployed military asset will be affected. That sentence, in a 25-page government strategy document released one day after a ceremony celebrating quantum innovation, is the most honest line in the entire week's worth of announcements. Not a research initiative, not a future planning effort, every deployed asset, already in the field, already potentially vulnerable to a machine that doesn't exist yet, but that official planning now treats as arriving within the operational planning horizon. The White House signed 2 quantum orders. What the Pentagon isn't saying is that for military planners, the question stopped being whether to prepare and became when the preparation has to be complete. The answer they gave themselves in binding written form 24 hours after the ceremony ended is 2031, and the quantum sensors being deployed to field units by September of 2028 represent the military's answer to a different question. What do you do about the threat that is already here, not the one arriving in the future? GPS jamming is happening right now. The sensor that cannot be jammed is being deployed in 27 months. The encryption protecting nuclear command communications is being migrated on a binding 5-year timeline. The counterintelligence apparatus is being pointed at university quantum labs and startup incubators. And the press covered it as a story about quantum computers.